I'd like to welcome all of you, those in the audience, and especially our panelists, and thank you very much for coming this evening. We have a very exciting group, and it certainly would take all evening to introduce them properly, but I'll just give you a snippet of their professional activities. As you all undoubtedly know, Grace Gluck, who is sitting directly opposite me, has for many years been a reporter, editor, art writer, and critic for the New York Times. She has also written numerous critical reviews and articles for several other publications, and she's appeared several times as a Channel 13 interviewer for television programs about art and artists. She is the author of a book entitled New York, the Painted City, and co-author of another book called Brooklyn, People and Places, Past and Present. Among Grace's many noteworthy accomplishments is the fact that she helped to initiate and was named a plaintiff in a 1970s lawsuit that resulted in the Times hiring more women and giving them better jobs, and I think that's a very commendable achievement. Jeffrey Hartman, who is sitting next to Roger here on my right, is Sterling Professor Emeritus of Comparative Literature and English at Yale University. He's the co-founder and project director for the Fortunoff Video Archive for Holocaust Testimonies and the author of far too many books for me to list here. So I'll just mention the latest, Scars of the Spirit, The Struggle Against Inauthenticity, which came out in 2002, The Longest Shadow in the Aftermath of the Holocaust, which was reissued in 2002, and the Jeffrey Hartman Reader, which Fordham University Press just published in 2005. Jeffrey Hartman was the first coordinator of what later became Yale's Muriel Gardner Seminar for Psychoanalysis in the Humanities, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, and he has twice given the Freud Lecture at Yale. After dancing professionally herself and showing her own choreography as well, Deborah Jowett, who is seated to Grace Gluck's left, began in 1967 writing a regular dance column for the Village Voice, where she remains today as the principal dance critic. Her articles on dance have been published in two collections, Dance Beat, 1977, and The Dance in Mind, 1985, as well as in numerous journals. Her third book, Time and the Dancing Image, was awarded the De La Torre Bueno Prize in 1988. In 1997, Deborah Jowett edited a volume on Meredith Monk for Johns Hopkins University Press. Her critical writing has appeared in many publications, and these include the recent Reinventing Dance in the 1960s. In 2004, Simon & Schuster published her critical biography of Jerome Robbins. In addition to lecturing and giving workshops both in the United States and abroad, Deborah teaches in the dance department of NYU's Tish's School of the Arts. Roger Copeland, directly to my right, is a professor of theater and dance at Oberlin College. He's co-editor of the widely used What is Dance and author of Merce Cunningham, The Modernizing of Modern Dance, published by Routledge in 2004. His essays about dance, theater, and film have appeared in the New York Times, the New Republic, the Village Voice, Partisan Review, etc., etc., etc. His theater criticism has been honored with both the Stage Bill Award and the John Gassner Prize for Dramatic Criticism. And I might also mention that Roger has just written and directed a feature-length fictional narrative film about the psychological aftermath of 9/11, which he is calling The Unrecovered. I'd also like to take a minute to thank Roger very much for joining us this evening. Ina Brader, who you may have expected to see here this evening, lost a family member this week and was unable to come. But I don't mean to make it sound as though Roger was a second choice.
Oh, go ahead.
No.
Be honest.
Not at all. The truth of the matter is that Roger has been on has been a key player in the Philoctetes Center, has been here on other occasions, and therefore we're delighted to welcome him back. Thank you for stepping up to the plate at the last minute for us.
Because I was going to come as an audience member.
Well, so here you are. Okay. William Wolfe, on my left, has written extensively on film and theater, and he has served as chair of the New York Film Critics Circle. He's currently president of the Drama Desk. In 1998, he founded and began publishing the Wolfe Entertainment Guide on the Internet, which is a site containing reviews of theater, film, and other cultural events. Since the early 1970s, Bill has been affiliated with NYU, where he teaches, among other kinds of courses, interdisciplinary courses on film and literature. Bill was for many years film critic and film editor for Q Magazine, and when Q was merged with New York Magazine, he became a critic and contributing editor, writing the On Film column. He subsequently became the syndicated film critic and columnist for the Gannett newspaper chain, and his articles have appeared in newspapers throughout the United States and in various national and international magazines. During the course of his career, Bill has interviewed hundreds of theater and film notables, including Ingmar Bergman and Charlie Chaplin and others, and he regularly covers the world's major film festivals. He's the author of Landmark Films, The Cinema and Our Century, which he wrote in collaboration with his wife, Lillian Kramer Wolf, who is here somewhere with us this evening, and the Marx Brothers. Finally, at last,
Really
we come to...
But worth the wait.
Yes, well worth the wait, exactly. Leon Balter, who is a training and supervising analyst at the New York Psychoanalytic Institute and an associate clinical professor at Mount Sinai School of Medicine. He is the co-author of a series of papers on the methodology of psychoanalysis, and he has published papers on the psychology of group formation and on how works of art achieve their psychological effects. He has also been extremely interested in the fantasy structure of movies, and several of his papers on art and film are devoted to the aesthetic illusion, which is something I think we'll undoubtedly get to a little bit more later. Leon's most recent publication is a paper on dreams within dreams, and on dreams within works of art, I believe. He has another paper that is about to appear on art within works of art, if I
And dreams within works of
and
art.
dreams within works of art. Good. Okay. Very recently, he presented a talk to the New York Psychoanalytic Society on the cult of the male musical entertainer. And that's our impressive lineup for this evening.
Wow. I'm impressed.
A few years ago, Terry Teachout wrote in the New York Times, and I quote, "Two kinds of critics provoke anger, bad ones and great ones." Clearly, we have only great ones here this evening, and I don't anticipate many angry responses to their remarks, but it is true that critics are often themselves the target of much criticism. In a rather wonderful moment in Waiting for Godot, for example, Samuel Beckett has one of his two principal characters, Vladimir and Estragon, suggest, quote, "Let's abuse each other," unquote, whereupon the two turn toward each other, and the dialogue goes like this. Vladimir says, "Moron," Estragon, "vermin," Vladimir, "abortion," Estragon, "morpion," Vladimir, "sewer rat," Estragon, "curate," Vladimir, "cretin," Estragon, "critic."
I mentioned the stage direction. He wilts, vanquished, and melts away, or something like that. I mean, it's the ultimate insult.
I myself suffered a minimal sense of abuse when I gave as a gift to a choreographer I had danced with for many years one of my own books of criticism, and was told, quote, "It's a lot harder to do it than to write about it." The antipathy of the artist for the critic is legendary. Jasper Johns once created an image called the critic sees, which Roger Copeland has described in print as, quote, consisting of a pair of eyeglasses mounted on a plastic base. Behind each of the lenses where eyes would normally reside, one finds instead two large and no doubt loud mouths. Apparently, as Roger tells us, Johns created the piece after watching a critic spend less than 60 seconds glancing at one of his paintings before proceeding to write about it. The analyst Donald Kaplan has explained what he rather cunningly called the unsettled relationship between the artist and the critic by saying that to the critic, contemplation is interpretation. To the artist, interpretation is desecration. And I'd like to begin this evening's discussion by asking you about your own experience of artists' reactions to your writings, whether you have been maligned by artists for not applauding their work in print, and if so, whether this has deterred you from reviewing their subsequent work. In other words, what I'm really getting at is whether artistic reactions to your reviews matter to you as you work, and whether you have in mind as you write critical reviews how the subject of your reviews might respond to what you're writing. And I think I'll pose that to Grace.
You called on me first. Well, I don't write for artists. I write for readers, and that is my mandate at the paper. I mean, I think every critic on the Times would say that. So of course it concerns me when artists don't like what I write, but I try not to let it matter, because I think I'm ultimately responsible to the person who reads my stuff. That's what I'm there for. I'm there to provide an interpretation or an approach so that someone might understand the work a little better, or understand it in the crazy way that I do. So I tend to put aside, not that I don't get a lot of response from artists, to tell you the truth, but I tend to put aside the angry ones. I remember one of them called me up at 4 o'clock in the morning to protest something that I had written, but I think that was the most alarming thing that happened to me.
Well, that would be alarming indeed. Would anyone else like to? Deborah?
I don't get a lot of negative responses, and of course they are wounding, but I think that very positive responses from artists have some sort of influence. I mean, I remember once somebody said, Anthony Tudor said to me, she's the only one who got what I was trying to do in Romeo and Juliet, and I thought, oh my God. Oh my God.
Compliment.
Yes.
Incredibly gratifying.
Yes, incredibly gratifying, and you tend to look at those reviews, not that you're writing, and I agree with Grace completely, you're not writing for the artist, you're writing for the reader. But there's something kind of wonderful when you feel that your view of the work was accurate and didn't betray what the artist was doing, and it was a piece you liked, and they found what you said about it intelligent, even perhaps if it was critical. And then you look back at your old reviews, and you think, how did I score with this one? You know, what was I doing that night that made me more sympathetic or more attuned? So they're kind of instructive if you get a compliment.
Have you actually, now that you mentioned looking back at your reviews, have you had the experience of reviewing a ballet or modern dance and then looking at your review some years later and thinking, after seeing the piece again, perhaps several more times, and changing your opinion of it, and feeling, I don't know, some regretful of having written what you wrote? I'm sure that must be that must happen not infrequently.
Yes, yes.
And then you probably feel
Take
as
my
though
foot out of my mouth. I actually rewrote something. I wrote writing for an informal paper. I did write not exactly an apologia, but some sort of some time ago I wrote this about this person, and I think it was the wrong thing to say for these reasons.
Something.
Yes, please.
I think all critics are sensitive to the idea of feeling an obligation to try to be as fair as possible to an artist, and knowing all of the work that goes into something. But it's sort of a trap to think too much of what the person you're writing about will say, and it's hard to get a little too close to some of the people as friends, and yet one does in the course of work. I've known many people who are in film or in theater who insist they don't read the critics. I'm always suspicious of that, but they insist I won't do it because no matter what the critic says, it's going to skewer what I'm doing, or I'm going to be, well, I'm better off not to do it. I've only had two people really complain to me. One was an actor who called me up and was furious at something I had written about him and said, I'm going to sig my mother on you. That was about the worst thing he could say.
The worst thing you could think of.
And the other was Mel Brooks. I had been in Yugoslavia when Mel Brooks was filming something. We got a little bit friendly there, and he was doing 12 chairs at the time. And when I wrote it, I didn't think it was funny enough. I thought it was interesting, but so on. I thought it was too busy and just worked too hard and wasn't quite funny enough. I got a call from Mel Brooks, very upset about the review. And Mel, what can I do? I didn't think it was that funny. Didn't you get the social significance? He said it hurt him, but he was someone who could call you up and do that. But those are the only two people that ever called up and complained about everything. I have had that experience, as you've had too, of people who say you really got what I wanted to say in it, so you feel good about that kind of thing. But basically, you're better off, as you say, writing for yourself and your readers, and not worrying too much about it, other than trying to be fair.
Yeah. There's also a big distinction, though, between people like William and Deborah, and to some extent Grace, who are journalistic critics who have a beat that you've got to cover. And so you invariably are going to be writing about work that you're not very enthusiastic about. Whereas I think it's probably fair to say that the rest of us on this panel have the luxury of deciding what we want to write about, because we're not really hired as journalistic critics, and so we can be enthusiasts.
Right. I must say, the works of art that I've studied psychoanalytically, I've had no complaints whatsoever because they were all dead.
Yes.
The art. However, studying those works of art very, very carefully, I always ended up with a feeling of tremendous awe, and was absolutely floored by the sheer genius of these creative people who could put together works of art. To be sure, these were great authors and filmmakers and things like that, but still, to study something very, very carefully, not unlike patients, where you get to know them very deeply and very well, and they take on a dramatic dignity that's always very, very awesome. And the same thing with work of art, a great work of art.
Well, my experience is like yours. I write mainly about artists who are no longer with us. So I sometimes fantasize that they will enter my dreams and respond to me this way. And in fact, in one case, I staged such a dialogue between Blake and Wordsworth. It wasn't really in response to me, but I had those two go at each other. And there is a genre called the dialogue of the dead, but I'm not dead yet, so I couldn't include myself. Now, I have had some flack, but it's from fellow critics. When I commented on Derrida, and especially on the de Man affairs, then I got some very, very sharp and almost vicious replies. And but that means that there really is a very important issue, which is not only particular to Derrida and de Man, but some feeling in those who reply that sharply that some very large cultural issue is involved, or there's a school, or there's a conspiracy. Right. And this certainly wasn't in my mind, but that is the feeling. The other time I got very negative, and I still to some extent do, has to do with the style of criticism. I've always felt that to write criticism is not a secondary activity, that it is, if it is not as creative as being an artist, it has its own integrity, and it should be done as carefully as the artist does his or her work. And somehow this was understood as puffing my profession, and that upset very many people who thought I was just over-dignifying, and that the purpose of criticism was to serve the creative writer, something I've always thought was the wrong approach. And there I got some very sharp and nasty comments.
Are there groups that organize around ideologies in criticism?
Yeah, oh yeah.
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
Particularly academic style.
Especially that's my point, especially in the academic world. So one wonders, what is it that motivates them? And that's why I introduced the question of that we are sinning against, or that we are that there's a coterie or a purely academic approach, and they don't really know what we are doing, and they are in the academy and it's an ivory tower. Now, for many reasons, as I'm sure all of you know, the Academy is hardly an ivory tower. The same things go on there as go on in the general world, and we are not just retainers, you know, making easy money. So there is that division too, which you were referring to more in terms of journalistic and general critics. Oh, there's one more thing. Which a kind of funny reply, which I think I should mention. I was foolish enough in a preface to one of my books of essays to thank my wife for chastening my style. And this critic said, "Not enough."
Criticism, by the way, is very tame these days compared to what went on years ago. I mean, when you read some of the acerbic comments that were made in other earlier periods, even though people may complain today, we're very gentle by comparison.
That's true. Very few Addison DeWitts from All About Eve.
George Bernard Shaw.
The Poison Pen.
What about
George Bernard Shaw's music theater dance.
the critics of the Impressionists, you know, in 19th century France?
Yeah.
Yes, yeah.
Kenneth Tynan.
Well, the responses to Wordsworth was savage. You know, this will not do. That kind of totally dismissive judgment.
How do you see this change in climate?
When?
Well, that criticism now is much more benign, less savage.
Well, that's part of it, but one of the things that I find that's rather discouraging is the way criticism has worked out in so many respects is that it's looked upon as a consumer guide.
Yeah,
I always feel that the ideal criticism should be when both the reader or listener, the case may be, and the critic have seen the work, and then you can have a discussion.
But excuse me, let me interrupt you for 1 minute, Bill, because I have a real problem with that. For example, when I read a movie review in the New York Times, I am very dismayed by the fact that the entire movie, that assumption is made, and that the plot of the movie is discussed as though I wanted to know everything that happened in the movie in advance of seeing the film. And so as a consequence, I never read the Times movie reviews. I read the last line to determine, you know, whether this critic is recommending it or not, and then I go see the movie if I decide to, and then I come home and I read the review and have that dialogue with the critic. But I really take offense at being told as much as I'm told by most.
Well, you're right. I mean, but some people do that, but one of the big complaints is that by the time someone gets finished reading a review in the press or even seeing the movie trailers, coming attractions, that you've already seen the play or the movie, and you don't have to see it because so much is told, and it's wrong. I mean, whenever I write, I try to tell it just enough.
But there is a tremendous pressure from editors and I suppose overseeing them publishers today to turn criticism into reviewing, you know, to make it a form of consumer guide. So basically it has to be the Roman circus syndrome. It's thumbs up, thumbs down. How do you want to spend your leisure time and money on the weekend? And so it's all about go or don't go, you know, as opposed to the relationship that a lot of us like to have with quote-unquote critics, if I can make this generic distinction between reviewers and critics, the people that you read after you've seen the work in question, and you read them because you're hoping they're going to deepen your insight into that work. So you're not reading them just to determine whether or not you want to go or not go.
I think there's a big difference between the use of a critic as a consumer guide and a critic writing as if he or she accepted that role. I mean, I know that my work would be used by somebody to determine if they want to go or if they want to book that person or whatever. But if I start writing that way, my writing goes to hell. You know, because then I'm giving advice and I'm saying things like, bust your ass to go to Brooklyn, as I think Clive Barnes once did about Elliot Feld. Yes, or you know, save your money and stay at home. It's just such a boring way of writing about anything. And so that the writing is going to communicate your feeling about the event or your response to it or details of it that are tantalizing or, in your case, too much. without your having to say, there's still some tickets, get down there, or don't miss this, or all those cliches that make writing less than fantastic to read.
Yeah.
Are you at all interested as critics or / reviewers in why you have selected a particular artist or artwork to write about? I'm sure Leon must think about this as
All
an
the time.
analyst. And that is, I guess, the reason that Francis and I selected the title for this panel that we did, The Critical Unconscious. There's always some kind of motivation operative in the choice of artists that one reviews, I would imagine. And I'd be curious to know whether this is something, actually Grace did a piece for the New York Times this week on Beatrice Potter in America, right? And I don't think that that's a typical choice of exhibit for you to have written. And so I'd be curious to know how,
Well, I've always been fond of Peter Rabbit.
I see.
And
Okay.
what fascinated me was that this was that Beatrice Potter this took account of her American audience, which I hadn't seen written about before. And so it's funny that piece found so many echoes in so many people. I mean, I've never heard so many comments as I have about that piece on Beatrix Potter.
The other Potter.
The other Potter, yeah. But no, I've always been fascinated by animals and by her approach and by people who wrote about animals. And it seemed like a natural to me to write about. So I do find myself attracted to artists who deal in certain subject matter, or whose work I've followed from, or first discovered, so to speak. I mean, does anyone ever discover anything? But I mean, that I like to think I've written about first, and I like to follow their work. And there are all kinds of impulses that I really can't, make a cogent catalog of it. But I'm sure other people have.
Yeah, I think there obviously is an elective affinity in some cases. I mean, why do I keep writing about Wordsworth? I mean, every essay, whatever the subject is, ends somehow or includes Wordsworth. Now, I've thought about it. I won't bore you with why.
We would be very interested.
I won't analyze myself.
Daffodils,
But there are other cases in which just chance operated, in which someone decided, why don't you try your hand? And the New York Review of Books sent me detective stories. I have no idea why they did it. So on a dare, I wrote a piece, and I got interested in detective stories because they never asked me again.
That's the mystery.
That's right. So I think it's a mixed bag. Now, I'm glad when actually I'm challenged from left field, from right field, and in the 50s, I just one more personal anecdote. In the 50s, when I did poetry reviewing, and one of the few cases when I actually dealt with living artists, I thought I had discovered a great modern poet who no one else had talked about. At least I had not. And this was A.D. Hope. I was so naive, I didn't know that A.D. Hope was very well known in Australia and not here. But I was so excited that I had made this discovery. But this happens also, that one is very naive, but that's also a virtue, I think.
Oh, I think so.
I was just thinking about when I first began to work at this. I thought I saw something in Alexander Nevsky that had to do with homosexuality, feminine masochism, the negative Oedipus complex. So I began to look into it, and I wrote a paper about that. I then got interested in Cabaret, which was about homosexuality and all of that. So I presented these papers to my colleagues, who said, "Leon, you're talking too much about homosexuality. maybe you should talk about something else. And it began to dawn on me that they were making interpretations about my interests, which is I'm embarrassed to say is sometimes endemic in my profession, and it shouldn't be.
When it was still officially declared a disorder, I suppose.
Well, I won't go into the politics of it. But it struck me that maybe there was some kind of a thread that ran through it, but it wasn't that. There was a thread, and it was really the one that you mentioned. And starting with Alexander Nevsky, I wrote it as a kind of the technique that Eisenstein used to make a Stalinist propaganda film, and why and how he did that, and that was one of the things that actually just blew my mind, that he was of how he constructed that movie, which, as I understand from critics, is not considered one of his greatest movies. But okay. But that's what started me on the whole idea of how works of art play upon the reader or the viewer, how they do that, and that led me into all kinds of byways and avenues of the deliberate construction of a work of art by sophisticated artists, and so all kinds of things came out of that. But what I also discovered was that they're all very different. Even though they're trying to evoke a particular kind of response from the viewer, the techniques that are used are really psychologically, in terms of the structure of the work of art, very, very different, and that was itself very, very amazing. But always, I don't want to talk too much about this, but really Aristotle was right. It had to do with discharge of tension that gets built up in the viewer, and the discharge is considered pleasureful, and that runs through all art. I don't think I'm saying anything very, very profound. Aristotle was after all there first, but still that kind of climax, and I'm using the word pointedly.
Well, but there's a lot of interesting art that's intentionally anti-cathartic, anti-climactic.
Well, maybe more modern ones.
Yeah, Brecht wrote extensive diatribes against Aristotle's notion of catharsis, arguing that it was politically reactionary, and that it's just a kind of letting off of steam that, otherwise might build up into more politically useful forms of expression.
I'm just wondering whether there is a subject here of critics or commentators, how the work of art works on them in terms of discovering them, because there must be a symbiosis of that kind. That would interest me very, very much.
I think that there are always artists that one enjoys writing about more because of something about the work, and it's almost as if you have those words, you have the right words. A critic once said to me, "I love writing about Twyla Tharp because you get to use all those luscious verbs like skid and snarl and twist and, and I think when I think about it, it's almost as if I have a little chest of words that and phrases and sentence structures
waiting to get out.
Waiting to get out for this particular artist or this particular kind of work, and so that when I write about, most of what you write about is, only some of what you write about is great, and only some of it is really terrible, and the rest is, it's okay here and not so good there, and but the things that you really, it is a personal thing, something you admire, something you love in yourself and you love it in them. And
necessarily ideological. It's
Yeah.
can be language, love of language, whatever is.
I'm not sure there has to be an admiration there. I have written a good number of articles on a particular French writer whose work I find extremely boring to read.
Who's that?
Do I have to tell you?
Yes.
Alain Robbe-Grillet.
Okay.
I do not like to read him, but I find him fascinating to write about. And I have
absolutely.
written, and I
you
teach
contribute
his-
something.
Yes, yes. And when my students, don't like reading him, then they come to class. I'm sorry? But
John Cage. I would much rather write about Cage than actually listen to his music.
Right, absolutely. There's another one. So there isn't necessarily an admiration.
But you're striking sparks off there. That intellect, your intellect is.
That's true.
There's certain artists, for example, if you're writing about Ingmar Bergman and his films, there's such depth to his work that invariably you begin to think of things about yourself or about people you know because of the deep way in which he approaches human behavior, psyche, relationships. And so you really enjoy writing about that.
But, I think there's a difference between something that's almost in a way a kind of careerism or opportunism where we all fall into this trap that we want to write about things that we can write about well. And that, I think, is a little bit different from writing about something that just really turns you on, that makes you feel more alive than you would under any other circumstances, that engages you intellectually, emotionally, viscerally. And so, I see those as almost two different sorts of critical impulses. I mean, you're not necessarily going to be using, whatever special vocabulary you might have in that latter case, but, you do feel, my God, this is a work of art that just thrilled me in a way that...
I'm not aware myself of ever feeling that I'm writing on something because I feel I can write it well. I am more aware of feeling I want to learn something, and it's the drive to learn something about what it is. It's very selfish. I write to educate myself.
But it depends on the subject.
Yeah.
That's true. That's
and
true.
And the purpose of what you're writing. I think that's true of a lot of critical writing.
Even when I'm full of admiration for
Wordsworth.
the person, the artist, sometimes the critic I write about, even when I'm full of admiration, I don't want that admiration to stop me from thinking.
Mm-hmm.
And so I get motivated, if you wish, to intellectualize.
Mm-hmm.
But I feel that's very important, and it's a little bit, as Lois said, it can also come because one is simply intrigued by someone, even when one doesn't immediately admire. And gradually, maybe this is I don't know whether this is purely favorable towards the commentator or critic, gradually one really gets to know that artist and begins to discover things in oneself, but also in the artist. Even when at the beginning, one was only intrigued and didn't really understand what was happening and so on. So there's that personalism always involved, it seems to me, there.
No, on the other hand, I sometimes find myself writing against something. I think that I admire it very much, and by the time I've finished writing, I've written myself out of it. I've talked myself out of it, and I think that's valuable. It's valuable to me to be able to discard what I thought, what I originally thought was
I don't want to say the obvious here, but Susan Sontag's notion of against interpretation.
against interpretation. Oh, I forgot about Susan. Yeah, no, but I find that it's very helpful to me to do that. It's a kind of catharsis. But, I mean, you have to have the right subject. I mean, you have to have a subject that you can gradually find yourself disliking.
I'd like to read you a statement here, a short statement from the analyst I referred to earlier, Donald Kaplan, and have your reaction to this. What psychoanalysis has added to the possibilities of interpretation has allowed the creative imagination of our century a new liberation. The artist is free to experiment and form only to the extent that the artistic outcome can find an interpretive reciprocity in a contemplative public. And here's the point. Could the art of our age be thinkable in a culture in which psychoanalysis did not exist?
No.
And Kaplan concludes it would be a solipsistic art and hence not art at all. And I wonder how Roger seems to be responding already.
No, but I'm responding in a way that's going to translate itself into. I mean, it's interesting you mentioned Sontag a moment ago because, in many ways, her Jeremiad in Against Interpretation in the early 60s was very much anti-psychoanalytic. She was saying we are reducing the sensuous surface of these works to their meanings, and that is a tremendous danger that we have she didn't harp on psychoanalysis, but, it was the idea that this means this as opposed to this is this. And so, I think that it's absolutely true that psychoanalysis has been one of the many ways that we have empowered the notion of interpretation, but interpretation itself is dangerous if it becomes a substitute for dealing with the sensuous surface of the artwork itself, and if it becomes an excuse for not describing what's there, for not doing close readings, for projecting onto the work, blah, blah, blah.
But the interpreter remains a writer. And the writer is bound, because of the love of words or whatever is involved, is bound to there is bound to be a creative spark in there if there's of any value. And I object to Sontag on this basis. I don't see only the artist, the novelist, and so on as creative. I think there is a type of creativity in what we do. So that's not answering, but that's answering more the Sontag allusion. With respect to Kaplan, I think it's most likely, I'm not quite sure how to digest that, most likely true that contemporary art has absorbed psychoanalysis, or as much of psychoanalysis as it can take, and it's been very valuable in that way. But what further to do with that statement, I don't know, because I don't think it's an absolutely clear statement anyway.
Well, what he does say, I don't think is correct.
Yeah. What?
It's very easy to contemplate a culture that deals with art that has absolutely nothing to do with psychoanalysis. I think that's it was a somewhat imperialistic statement. And,
yeah, I think so.
I belonged a few years ago to a group of psychologists and psychiatrists who were movie fans, and they met to discuss movies, and always they discussed them from a psychoanalytical point of view. So it was quite amazing what would happen in these discussions. And so there was that closeness in what the films were revealing to them and what they felt that related to the culture and to the profession. So it was very interesting, but in a way it was kind of limiting, but it was amusing. For instance, they would discuss Woody Allen's crimes and misdemeanors, where somebody has his, the woman who's a threat to him assassinated and has to live with it. And they discuss the concept that the only way, if you were treating this person, would be that you'd have to convince the person to ruin his life by going to the police, admitting guilt, in order to be properly treated. But there was this closeness of what you're talking about in their reactions and their interpretations. You know, I was a lay person in it, as you can gather.
You know, I just wanted to say I'm finding myself a little skeptical about the theory that criticism is creative, because after all,
only one.
after all, when you're writing about somebody's work, you're reacting to it. It's a reactive kind of thing, and you have not created the work. You may construct a criticism about it, but can one really call that creative?
Why not?
Yeah.
I don't see.
Well, freely associative in the same way that creating a work of art is.
Right.
It's more focused. It's got a different kind of. It's got a predetermined context.
But there's an art.
Nevertheless, it seems to me that it's every bit as creative as any other kind of writing, that all writing...
It's sort
It's
of
a
like
genre
translation,
distinction.
say poetry
It's a genre
translation.
distinction.
You know, it's a fine translation of a poem is in itself a work of art, but
absolutely.
we
Yes, but-
certainly acknowledge that it's secondary in that it's
you can.
riffing off
Yeah.
something
Yeah.
previously written. So, I mean, I think you can be creative without being the primary creative
Yeah.
act.
Right, and I mean, there are some great critics, very few, but some that you read as literature. I mean, you read
Oh, sure.
for the very same pleasures
Yeah.
that you do more primary forms of literature. But they're the exceptions.
Yeah,
to
but
the
primary and secondary, although I think there is a genre distinction, and the genre can be defined of commentary as against the work of art. But as soon as you say primary and secondary, I know, then you think of primary process and secondary process.
Oh,
I mean, is
and
the
then the
te-
conversation is over.
I didn't hear that. Primary is more important than secondary.
Yeah.
Is
Well,
I
it's
saw it
definitely a
as
slippery slope, 'cause there are-
a value hierarchy.
I mean,
Well,
is
that's
the
the point.
Talmud the same as the Bible?
Is what?
Well,
The Talmud the same as the Bible?
Talmud itself, from the little that I know of it, Talmud is creative in and of
Oh,
itself,
yes.
and very, very rich.
I mean, there are so many works of art that are brought into being essentially as reactions against earlier works of art rather than representations of the natural world. So, you know, in that sense, it is very hard to make up some kind of generic distinction between art and criticism. But I think, you know, when it comes to just looking at the results, I would much rather go with the artist and the critics. And, you know, in other words, if I have to choose who I'm going to take to the desert island, it's
Sure.
going to be
Okay. But you know, we don't want that choice.
On a very practical level, the novelist, the poet, sits down at the word processor, the typewriter, and thinks, what am I going to write about today? Or what am I going to... I don't have to do that. I sit
Right.
down at the typewriter
You've got a
and say,
subject.
I'm going to write about what I saw 2 weeks ago at such and such a place, or last night.
But
That
there's
is a
still an
problem.
art to the way you write it.
Well, there should be, but that's why I don't object to the term secondary, because I know it's creative, but I have to acknowledge that it didn't spring from my...
You don't have the panic. Well, you might,
don't
but
know.
you don't have the panic in front of the, like Mallarmé,
Blank
in front
page.
of the blank
No.
page. We have our own panics, but they have to do with deadlines and other things. No, I was going to go just back to the question of psychoanalysis and the importance, after all, in Freud, and which Lacan then brings back, of the engagement with words and the association of words, and Freud's a book on wit and jokes. And I know there's something in me going on when I'm thinking about art that has to do with verbal play or something sonic, something linguistic is going on. And here and there I can even catch what is going on, but it's very rare. Now, I'm not sure the artist wants to catch what is going on, but he wants to take that energy and move forward. And when I catch it, it stops me. And I have to think about it, and I become maybe too reflective about this when I find that I've been actuated or motivated by a terrible pun.
Well, Freud also said that aesthetic pleasure, correct me, Leon, if I'm wrong, that aesthetic pleasure derives from the fantasy that we allow ourselves to engage in without any sense of shame or inhibition over
That's
it.
certainly
That's a
certainly part
cathartic,
of it.
maybe.
But that's certainly. I'm not sure that I could add anything more, because the statement really is so very, very general. But there's certainly well. What you're saying is there has to be if I can put it this way, an altered state of consciousness, that you make yourself receptive to the work of art by it taking over your fantasizing mental life, and then and then I think you're subject to the to the manipulations of the artist. And all that that's entailed in that. And a good artist will make it so that you don't become self-conscious about it. You don't break off like in a dream, in a nightmare. You break off and you stop dreaming. A good artist will carry you through, but it'll be in another realm of mental life than the everyday, practical, logical, pragmatic.
So how does an artist manage this suspension of disbelief, which keeps
That's
us
the
going?
art.
Yeah.
Well, you know what Freud said in the Dostoevsky paper. He says, before the creativity of the artist, psychoanalysis lays down its arms.
But we can't here.
I mean, for example, the book 100 Years of Solitude, the Marquez book, which is totally off the wall. I mean, it's very surreal when you read it, and you absolutely know that none of these things could possibly be happening, and yet it carries you through the entire book, and you draw from it. I find it
in part because the magic is grounded in realism, hence the notion magical realism. I mean, it's that tension.
Yes.
And that never happens, or very rarely happens in commentary and criticism. We have to do without the suspension of disbelief, it seems to me.
But you know,
The first time around,
I'm thinking more about the reader who approaches a critical commentary. She has to believe that the artist means what the critic means what the critic is saying, that he is not I think in most cases not playing with the reader or allowing that kind of suspension of disbelief.
Any intellectual, as opposed to artistic engagement, you got to have your wits about you.
You have to about your wits.
Yeah, I mean, because we're leaving out a key word. It's willing suspension of disbelief. In other words, you're suspending your disbelief. It's not necessarily imposed upon you. I mean, at least in the Coleridgean.
No, but it's a seduction, isn't it? Willing simply means that you allow yourself to be seduced.
Right.
It doesn't mean conscious.
Right.
don't you think you raised the specter of Susan Sontag, who was so influential in the 60s, and I think that when we're looking at a piece of art, the art itself produces a way of looking at it, invites us to look at it in a particular way. And when Sontag was writing, she was primarily, if I'm not mistaken, looking at George Balanchine and Merce Cunningham, who were both artists who said, forget what it means. It is what it is. Whatever you want to make of it, that's what it is. I made it. Don't think about my inner thoughts. Don't think about what stories I'm trying to tell you. And I think that is the way, when we looked at that work, it invited us to see it in a particular way.
It was a kind of phenomenological approach.
Yes, it was very formal. It was like the new criticism in poetry. It was to look at the form, the structure, how all the elements fused, and whatever they produced for you. Now, if you see, tremendously deconstructed narrative dance, you're going to approach it in a much more different kind of possibly psychoanalytic, you're going to get into a lot of background material and motivations and things.
I think the bad deconstrucstructionists do that.
Bad deconstructionists.
Because when you read Derrida, you cannot say, I mean, he is one of the most creative and how shall we put it, because not many writers are really seduced by, not many intellects are seduced by him, but he allows himself, he's inventive. He is probably more inventive than any other philosopher I have read. I mean, a contemporary philosopher. You might call him too ingenious, but he is very inventive, and he takes, he takes things from anywhere he pleases. He goes anywhere he pleases. But I agree that the mechanical demystification that sometimes accompanies deconstruction is what I think you were referring to.
Well, I think philosophies filter down to artists in rather personal ways.
Yes, that's true.
So that may be a kind of simplistic form of deconstruction that you're often seeing.
If you're going to mention philosophy in this light, I'm going to segue here into something that's kind of a loaded question, but nonetheless, Arlene Croce's article discussing the undiscussable, 1994, she wrote, a critic has three options: to see and review, to see and not review, and not to see. And in fact, that was the problem with her review of her article on Bill T. Jones's Still/Here, which both Roger and Deborah have written about. And maybe you would like to comment on this idea of a critic writing about something they haven't seen, which is what she did.
It was a tour de force.
What tour? What force?
Well, it got her a lot of attention. I don't think.
I believe the only dance article that's ever been mentioned on CNN and the BBC.
Yeah, Colin
She
showed.
hadn't actually seen the work.
She had not seen it, and she used the article to criticize what she thought it might have been and to explain why she wouldn't go to see it. And, well, to me, it's just a dereliction of duty, you know.
But you know, what I was so ambivalent about that piece because on the one hand, as you say, it's completely irresponsible to write about something that you haven't seen. But she could have written, you know, there was so much out there that did in fact fit the description of victim art that she was imposing upon that work of Bill T. Jones. And so there was an enormously valid argument being made in that article, but she had the wrong victim and the wrong art. I mean, that particular piece of Bill T. Jones, I found thoroughly underwhelming, but not an example of what she wanted to write about. You know, not an example of the kind of work that performs a kind of emotional terrorism, where by virtue of its subject matter, it tells you you must genuflect before this because of its earnestness, because, you know, it's a kind of sentimentality that she was talking about, but, you know, what Joyce called unearned emotion. And that was an enormously valid point to be making, but she really shot herself in the foot by beginning with that ridiculous premise of using a work that didn't fit the description of victim art and writing about something that she hadn't seen. So, you know, I mean, my reaction was really a plague on both your houses, on both Bill T. Jones and Arlene Croce. I mean,
Well, it was a very clever way of, I thought it was a very clever device of calling attention to this particular idea of, you know, that certain works really turned her off because of their, as you say, their supposed power to terrorize you.
right.
I mean, I thought it was a clever,
But it
not
was
more than that.
abusive. It was abusive for
It
power.
was abusive, and it was off track, not to say off the wall. But,
Do you think that, since you write now primarily for the internet, that we have to change our understanding of critical responsibility, given that it's out there for everyone, and has the electronic age and high technology made any substantial change in the critical arena?
There are a lot of changes going on. First of all, the internet allows many people who maybe have no business being critics or calling themselves critics to pretend they're critics and to have their blogs and whatever and get certain things started without any kind of basis. On the other hand, the internet offers a whole new venue for many people who are serious about criticism to have a different outlet and to reach people all over the world and to write something that doesn't disappear but stays up there for a long period of time and people can access. So that's important. A lot of the institutions, the theaters, the advertising agencies, the producers of films and stage productions are just beginning to be aware of the internet. For a while they didn't take it too seriously, but by now they have to because it's all over the place. And many important people writing for the internet and people writing for publications also have their material on the internet. So that it's a vast change that is beginning to take place. In some ways it's for good, and in some ways it isn't, but I think that's true of almost any media.
Which brings me to an idea about what I think you mentioned something about this earlier. How much explanation does this, I mean, because of this new audience, so to speak, how much explanation does one now have to bring to criticism? I mean, you find yourself writing about something.
Well,
go ahead.
Oh,
the people may not have the references, you know, they may not understand.
This is partly with the internet. You know, when you teach students, a student will come in and say, the greatest picture I saw in my life, it really moved me, was when Harry met Sally. There's no reference point, there's no history for so many people. And on the internet, you can have this situation, but there's a difference with the internet. You cannot write in a very lengthy way on the internet because people can't read it that way. If they print it out, but most people are you know, going down rather rapidly and scanning. So it's changed the style of writing. So it's a challenge of trying to get as deep as you can in as succinct a way as you can on the internet.
But what I mean to say is the audience today is, I mean, it's not as literate as it once was. I mean, when you had an English audience in the 19th century, they knew all those references to gods and goddesses and mythology and the Bible and everything else. People today couldn't have, they don't have a clue generally as to.
Well, this is a challenge
so
to try to reach people in that way.
Yeah.
I'm not sure the people writing for the internet know those references either. So, you know, it's not.
Well, that's true.
You know, I think there's a kind of mutuality of ignorance for the most part.
No, and I will defend the internet. I mean, I think it's wrong to try to cast it aside as inferior. It has the possibilities of being used very, very well, but there's a mixture.
I'm gonna say, I mean, Deborah can probably speak more knowledgeably about this than I can, but you know, there's a lot. As the venues for serious dance writing in print disappear, there are people like Toby Tobias, for example, who can now be read on the web in ways that she can't be in print, and I think that's a godsend that a writer of her.
Yeah, I mean, it's too bad she doesn't get paid for it.
Yeah.
That's the problem with the web, trying to negotiate a situation.
There's a lot of exploitation going on.
A lot of exploitation going on. But yes, it means that somebody like that can write. She writes at enormous length, the way she could not probably write in a publication, a print publication.
Yeah, and just out of desperation, people who are absolutely driven to write are turning to the net, even if there's no remuneration. And I think that's an incredibly admirable.
And often no editing, which is
This is a problem, isn't it?
Right. No.
I would like to open this up to the audience, but before I do, I would like to do something perhaps a little unusual. One of my heroes is in the audience tonight, and I would like to ask Jaak Panksepp, who happens to be an extraordinary neurobiologist, neuroscientist, whether he looks at art any differently than the rest of us sitting here this evening, because he knows things about the brain and things about perception and things about creation and creativity that perhaps we don't know, certainly we don't know, and whether you see art differently because of that hard scientific. Yes. Yeah.
Anyone who wants to say anything, please use the microphone.
Well, the short answer is no. I think the long answer is that the more I do science, the more I appreciate art. And I am contemplating how science would emerge if it cultivated the artistic vision a bit more. I have been traveling now for almost a month without being at home for a week with my artistic wife, who brings me more pleasure than all the science that I've been visiting.
That's a Freudian matter.
Yes, it is. Yes. Let's not go there then. Here's an example. I was at the Society for Neuroscience meeting in Washington, D.C. for a solid week, and something has happened in science which is rather horrible, which is a desire, maybe artists have done this every once in a while too, is where they are desperately trying to impress each other to the point where everyone is bored. I mean, this is a wonderful meeting, had 32,000 people. The first keynote was by the Dalai Lama. And, you know, there had been an uprising by Chinese scientists to keep the Dalai Lama off the podium. Now, Dalai Lama did not prepare anything. He just came onto the podium. People had to go through metal detectors. You know, it was a circus. But the Dalai Lama did not make it a circus. He was in a new environment, and the first thing he did was he behaved as a human being, and he explored the environment. He, you know, looked down, and I mean, he didn't come with a different attitude, and, you know, he struggled for ideas, and he looked for words, and finally he found his key thought. And his key thought moved the audience, and his key thought was that, you know, religion has these wonderful old stories. And often these old stories come in conflict with science. And, you know, these scientists who spend a lot of time trying to find reality in a very narrow way. But when there's a conflict between the vision of religion and the facts of science, then the vision of religion should try to change. Should try to change. This was such a dramatic, refreshing idea. It was the most powerful idea at the meeting for me. Then we had Solomon Snyder. How many people have heard of Solomon Snyder? He is one of the greats in American science. He was supposed to get the Nobel Prize after he got the Lasker Prize about 15 years ago for discovering the first receptor in the brain, which was the opiate receptor. Of course, the real hard work had been done by Candace Pert. And Candace Pert was a graduate student with a large spirit and a big mouth. And she decided to get down on Solomon that she also hadn't received the prize. So you get scientists squabbling this way. It's rather horrible. I mean, I don't see the artists squabbling that way. The artists...
Look harder.
Not for the Nobel Prize,
I knew I would get
perhaps.
that response. And the critical phrase was, that way.
That
But,
way, yeah.
But scientists have always squabbled, too.
Well, of course. I mean, it's human nature to squabble. And I think in some way, great art eventually comes if you take yourself outside the squabbling and you get in touch with a spring, a reservoir inside yourself that is desperately trying to get out, but the world around you in some way is not facilitating that. And when it comes out, and it comes out with a clarity and reality that indicates the artist's integrity, then you have great art. I think that's the same place great science comes from. And a lot of times in the present environment, we're not getting great science because all of a sudden we have technologies that are so incredibly powerful. So I just came from Chicago, working with a group at Northwestern, and they are working at a molecular biology level, gene expression patterns. You know, inside of our bodies, we have 30,000 genes. It's like an orchestra of 30,000, and creating us all the time. And all of a sudden, we have techniques to try to listen to the orchestra But in fact, our techniques are not listening to the orchestra, they're listening to individual instruments. And from listening to the individual instruments, we in some way want to fathom what the orchestra is doing, and we don't have a way of doing it. We're going to require an artist to make that translation. And so anyway, those are just reflections.
Okay, some questions for our panelists. Yes.
Something that came up at the beginning and kind of got superseded by the discussion of the idea that critics used to be more savage than they have been for some time, and I think that came out of a change where you had the beginning of a fragmentation of worldview. I mean, I think through the 50s you had accepted views of high culture, low culture, and culture in general, and I think starting in the 60s that began to break down. I was performing with Meredith Monk in the late 60s when Deborah started writing, and as far as I'm concerned, you single-handedly transformed dance criticism from a platform for a critic to have an attitude and lay down the law about things to somebody who looked at things. And you were talking about part of that was a response to the people who were working the performance, that maybe it was all part of something that was happening. And I think that if that's something that people would like to speak to, that this cultural fragmentation and the fragmentation of worldview really has transformed criticism as well as art.
Yeah, I think people at one point knew what was supposed to be correct, even though there were always rebels.
Yeah.
There were always rebels, but somehow critics always wrote from a vantage point of the known, you know, I think at one time. But John Simon wrote like that till the end of his tenure at New York Magazine.
But he belonged to, his mindset was from a different era.
It seemed that way, did it not? Yes, yeah. Yeah.
At least you knew where he was coming from.
Yes.
Sure did.
I think in the last 30 years, there's also been a greater fear among journalistic critics of being perceived as not being with it if they don't understand the quote-unquote, these media phrases like cutting edge, the idea that the whole notion of an avant-garde has become mainstream, and the new thing is what the critic is expected to discern and celebrate. And the fear of missing that new thing, I think, leads to...
Nobody wants to be the one that said Picasso couldn't draw.
Exactly.
But then we get also, to follow up your thought, a more distinct conception of generations. In other words, not just fragmentation or high culture and low culture, but almost as if each generation has its own identity. And there's that, if you wish to call this a fragmentation, there's something there
I think
too.
you're right, because I think there was a cultural continuity that went on from sometime before World War I through the 50s that has changed radically. And I think there was more continuity from generation to generation.
But Jeffrey, the new generation, the next generation, did not recognize authority with the same. I think that's what you're getting at.
I agree.
That authority has broken down, and that's really part of that other generation, the next generation.
That started before.
I'm thinking of it in terms of a reader, and this critic and artist thing, and I see the artist, of course, as higher, and that I'm trying to learn. So in order to learn, I can't always understand entirely, of course, what the artist is writing. I will look at the critic, and some of what the critic says will help me to understand, and some of what the critic says will make me more. I'll learn from the critic as well. In addition to which, I will learn how to live better, and I will be a critic. And I will pick and choose because I am trying to be the artist in an indirect sense myself. But it's the artist I'm looking at, and it's the artist who has that magic. The artist I'm looking at for what I'm looking for, and each one has something different that they are contributing or putting forward that is worthwhile. And of course, there might be those artists that it's not so. And, you know, I'm not denigrating the critics, and I need the critics, but I'm looking for something, you know, which stems originally from those artists or stems from me.
No, I'm just free associating here as an editor. And I would say to the reader, it depends what you're going to read. Whether you're going to read about an artist in the New York Times or in People magazine or in Partisan Review, which I happen to be working, or the way Jeffrey writes, whether he writes for Raritan or for Yale Review, is going to be different. So it's up to, call it the consumer. And that may well be generational. Okay.
Yes.
I'd like some of the panelists to speak about being an artist and a critic. Roger mentioned works of art that are reactionary to other works of art, which may then be seen secondarily as a piece of criticism themselves. Or as Roger has just made a film, and I think, Deborah, you used to dance. She still does. What's the difference for you when you're considering yourself an artist or you're considering yourself a critic? Are they completely different hats? Is there a gray area in between? You know.
It feels different, except that I'm the same person, so that my values are the same. The considerations and the way of working are different. I'm in one way, I'm putting myself out there as an object if I'm performing, which I don't do very often, you know. And I think of myself then as an artist. It's a hard question to answer, because I was dancing for so long and choreographing before I was writing about other people. And the writing about other people came quite naturally, because I'd always written and because this was my world. And so it was just one more function of my world, to write about it, to do it. And I sort of did a juggling act, and I think I didn't think too deeply about it. I just did it. Maybe Roger coming late.
And this is going to sound all too convenient, given where we are, all too psychoanalytically correct. But on those rare occasions when I have engaged in an activity that I've thought of as quote-unquote creative rather than critical or scholarly, I do think there's a certain sense in which I've allowed my unconscious to bubble up, you know, in a way that I don't when I'm writing criticism. You know, there's a certain sense that a certain kind of censor is not only not there, but I don't want it to be there. You know, I want to engage some part of myself that flows a little more freely. You know, it ultimately needs then a secondary editor to check it. Otherwise, you know, you're in the realm of surrealist automatism, where, you know, it just all pours out without any editing at all. But you know, for me, it's as simple as that. You know, it's
that simple.
Okay. And I think I know what you're going to say, but I should let you say it.
Well, I won't allow you to say it. I want to say it. No. You have entered a certain institutionality when you, as you say, allow yourself to bubble up. That in itself, you know that the institution, if I may put it this way, of creative writing expects or allows that.
Right.
Similarly, when you do criticism or commentary, you adjust to something that has become an institution. And when you write for Partisan Review or Raritan, you know what you are writing for. You don't know exactly who the readers will be, but you have a good sense of the essay form. And you might push at the boundaries of that, but this helps you to write what you're writing. So the reason I say it's not so simple is because you still deal with an institution, or if you wish, a genre, and you just don't bubble over. You have a good sense of what has been done before you. Or around you.
And also, I think, to undermine my own argument here a little bit, that I think what you said earlier about creative punning, for example, as a critic, is a highly creative form of improvisation. Thank you. And certainly there are always elements that enter even the most scrupulously discursive, linearly formulated argument, elements of chance that enter in. And in that sense, that the distinction between the creative and the critical tends to break down. But I think maybe it's a difference of degree rather than kind. That that it's not an absolute ironclad distinction. But I just feel a whole different kind of freedom. And the irony is that the creative stuff comes, doesn't mean that I'm a good artist or even an artist, but the creative stuff comes so much more easily to me than criticism. I know I did not procrastinate for 1 second in working on this movie that I've spent 4 years on, whereas, when I'm writing an essay about something, 90% of the time is spent procrastinating, and about 10%, at the very last minute when the editor says it was due 2 weeks ago, then that's when the writing gets done.
But do you think it has something to do with the art form that you're writing about? In other words, the act of writing a poem and writing a review of a poem are sort of close in terms of the fact that you're sitting and you're writing. Whereas writing a review and dancing require a whole different set of receptors and it's probably the same with
dancing.
Film.
Is really very special because of the text is the body, or includes the body, and it's not that same notation. That is, there have been
organization.
What?
Not just notation, but
right.
organization.
I mean, I shouldn't be saying this to you,
And
but there's
even in painting and sculpture would be very different from sitting to write. Sculpture is such a physically compelling act, physical act. Painting too.
Of course, there are many who claim that poetry is closer to the bodily consciousness than other types of writing. It may be. It may be.
Yeah. There's about mathematics too. I think there's one person, there's one person.
Hi, I think I'd like to address this. I'm sorry, forget your name.
Yes.
William Wolf.
Oh, Mr. Wolf. I think it's mostly about. Am I making that sound? No. Okay. About film, which kind of has taken over, I think, the world right now. In terms of people go to see film. And some people see theater, some people see dance, but feels like everybody sees film. And as far as criticism goes, because this woman did point out, there are a lot of really intelligent pieces done about art in various publications, Parts and Review, and I think even the New York Times, the writing on art criticism is a lot probably more well thought out than, say, other forms, say maybe even film, because maybe A.O. Scott is writing for a broader audience than Ms. Gluck. And I'm just sort of struck by, and this kind of occurred to me because I happened to be at a used bookstore and I grabbed a book and it was film reviews from back in the 20s, and I happened to open up to Carl Dreyer's Joan of Arc. And it was just so thoughtful and so restrained in a way that a lot of film criticism isn't. And there's a funny thing, I don't know, this seems totally off left field, but Matt Groening, the guy who does The Simpsons, and he did this whole series, Life in Hell. I don't know if you're familiar with that. And he has these two characters, Akbar and Jeff.
and he did like this funny thing on how to be a critic. And one of the little boxes was like pick from A and B, and it was like, you know, wonderfully magical, and beautifully, you know, moving, and that is what you see in the bold type on all the, you know, the reviews for film, and that is what most people are exposed to now. That's probably what most people read when they read reviews, or film reviews, and it seems so dumbed down, and such a shame because that's the art form that the majority of people are going to see at this time.
It depends who you read and where, and there's an odd mix. Television has dumbed down things a lot. The pressure to spend a minute on something that opens up in a newscast. Newscasts themselves have become dumbed down. Some of the young people, as a counter reaction to that, are seeing the Daily Show and getting their news from that because it's more fun.
It's also more accurate, though.
More accurate, yeah. But also, but what's happened is, I think you're referring to, you know, when you talk about these ad quotes, there's so many people, and we have a word in the profession of that, quote whores. There are people who go on junkets after junkets, junket after junket, and they are always going to get a good quote. You'll see before the thing opens, you'll have names that are quoting things in the most extravagant ways. Now, there's nothing wrong with going on a junket per se if you're seriously writing an article or a piece on something. It's an opportunity to interview people. But this goes beyond that. And people get a name for themselves by having themselves quoted. And the public is largely, you know, you have to fault the public for this. I mean, you're presenting a more discerning view of it. But I can't tell you how many times people say, I love your reviews in such and such a place. And I found that in a period when I was writing for Q Magazine, for example, or for the Gannett papers, they weren't even reading the reviews. They were quoting the quotes of the reviews. And, you know, it was very interesting about this idea of writing something that you haven't seen, or this was at an intellectual level. But it's like a cocktail party. How many times as you go around, people have a strong opinion on a movie they haven't seen, or on a play they haven't seen. They've read about it, they've read the reviews, so they know all about it. So this is a mixture, and I agree with you. There's a lot of dumbing down. On the other hand, you have to choose the places and the people who you feel are not dumbing down and really have something to say that is addressed to your intellect, and I think that's very important. Yeah, I don't know if that helps answer.
I think one of the reasons we don't see a lot of good writing about film today is that we don't see a lot of good films. I mean, somebody like Anthony Lane, who is a wonderful writer in The New Yorker, does not have a lot of wonderful films to write about. And something we haven't discussed is the extent to which good criticism is really dependent on good art. That it's very hard to write great criticism unless there is great art out there to inspire it. And I think, you know, if Anthony Lane had been writing 20 years ago, you know, when Godard and Antonioni and Mitsuguchi and this incredible galaxy of auteurs were working, I think he would have been one of the great movie critics of all time.
What?
It's to Dr. Panksepp, whose comments I thought were just marvelous. And I agree with you of the beauty and the clarity of both art and of great science. But one thing that I would take issue with is, and I agree with you that many of the technologic aspects of the neuroscience meetings, these huge circuses of people, are boring without a doubt because frequently many of us don't know the language, what specifically they're saying, but they supply the fertilizer and the soil from which a person, say like a Newton, will come by and be able to pick out the true grains and really build on things. So I think that the exciting thing that's happening in science today, as with art, It's a liberation of how we get to the internal the internal things that we all, the universals that we have with all within us. So my only comment about not being so pessimistic about where our technology is taking us to. And just think of the astronomy, the 14 dimensions, the fact that black holes no longer just suck things out, but they're giving things toward us, and the marvelous detail of that we are able to appreciate of the 3 rings, or the multiple rings of Saturn, that when Galileo first discovered it, said, I don't understand what this is all about. And in his correspondence with his daughter, they both brought out that whatever is seen or learned in science, it comes from God or whatever religion is.
Matthew, and then Francis.
Two kinds of dialogue have been alluded to in the critical work tonight, the one with the work of art and the one with the audience or the reader. I'm wondering about another one. Professor Hartman referred to the case of Paul de Man, and in that case much was made of the relationship between this mature critic and his younger self. In his case, he wrote a bunch of anti-Semitic articles in a newspaper. Anyway, I'm wondering whether any of you feel yourselves in dialogue with others of yourselves, earlier ideas you've had, and what role those sorts of conversations might play in your process. I realize it's probably a big question, but I throw it out.
This is the kiss and tell moment. I mentioned that whatever I write on always ends up on Wordsworth, wherever I start. And of course, one thinks, why is this? But in a way, the explanation is too simple. I know when I came across Wordsworth, it was when I was a refugee, a displaced child of Europe, as I called myself. And it so happened that the English countryside into which I was displaced, and studying Wordsworth came together. I didn't realize at that time what it would do to me, but it came out. So in this case, it's not a very, well, not a very deep, but a very clear instance of one's younger self remaining. In the case, if I may just say this, of de Man, it's more complicated, I think, than that. He didn't really write a bunch of anti-Semitic articles. He wrote one very, very, very dubious, to say the least, article. But it's the charge, I think, that deconstruction, when deconstruction came in, not through him but through Derrida and then his espousal of it much later, that this is a continuation of the younger de Man is just unprovable and very, very, very unlikely. That is, not everything that one does, right, can be so directly attributed to one's own personal history, it seems.
I think that I don't think there's any critic who, if you read what you've written many years ago, some things will please you. You will say, gee, I really like the way I said that. And other things you'll feel you could have said it much better. And not so much that you change your mind about something in the context of now. I once criticized, I remember Richard Schickel, because in a chapter we wrote in our book, because he had panned something of Fellini in a way that it turned out to be a great particular work. And he said, there should be a moratorium on anything a critic wrote after 10 years. I like that because it's a fact that we do change the way we express ourselves. We may change our attitudes towards something. We grow, or we should.
But do you think that moratorium is really necessary? Criticism, I'm talking about academic criticism, not your criticism, has a half-life. And when I teach my students, I never used to teach anything that I had written about, under the assumption that they would read. I've read what I have written. But after a while I saw that that wasn't true at all.
Babe, you.
So I began...
You don't sell many texts like that.
So now I teach whether I've written on it or not. And I asked them about critics who've written 20, 25 years ago. They have not read anything. These are graduate students, by the way.
That's what we were talking earlier about Trilling, about Kenneth Burke, people that we both admire. Who nobody reads.
But they come back. They come back.
Oh, they come back. I agree that they come back.
I mean, a moratorium it can't exist because, people are going to bring it up, are going to remember it anyway.
Right. But I'm not. It's still. I think the judgment is out. I think this happens with artists. They come back, even after centuries.
Yes, they do, certainly.
Yeah, I agree with you. I am not so sure about critics. We'll see. We won't see. We won't be there to see.
Well, I mean, people still read Baudelaire for his criticism.
Yes, but that is
reading Baudelaire. He's a constant.
Yeah, it's like T.S. Eliot.
I mean, we never left Baudelaire alone.
Yeah.
So it's not that we're coming back to him. I think he's always been on the scene.
But I mean, we appreciate, maybe even over-appreciate, as in the case of T.S. Eliot, his criticism because the poetry authenticates it.
That's true, too.
Right.
So if people become interested again in a particular artist or writer,
they will
go back to read
yes.
criticism, whether it's in scholarly journals or newspaper files.
But if I want to be immortal this way, then I have to start beginning to write poetry now. It's a bit late. Or to dance or something.
Or you can be like Aristotle and write a poetics. And that which brings me to a question I really wanted to put to Roger. We haven't really been skirted the issue of goodness. Like in Aristotle, you have what is good. Is it edifying? Is it beautiful? Or beauty is truth? Or in play, if we took Plato, we'd have to kick all the poets out of the Republic.
Right.
But the question of a critic identifying what is really good. But let's go back to our friend Susan Sontag. And this is really a question. It's to throw the ball at Roger. She wrote 2 essays on photography. One essay sort of said that photography had a rendezvous with reality, and the other essay kind of said that a photography, I'm really oversimplifying, but said the reverse in a kind of way. These were 2 diametrically opposed essays, equally wonderful. Now, I truly believe what Deborah was saying earlier, that criticism and art are 2 different functions of the brain, and the brain is something that really concerns us in the Philoctetes Center, the ratiocinative function, the analytic function, the intuitive function. In fact, we have an experiment going on intuition and education by Oliver Turnbull in Wales. But in the case of Susan Sontag, this is a different type of criticism that it veers more towards, it strikes me, art. I mean, I don't care whether it's good. Photography is good because of its relationship to reality, or it's not. I like to read Susan Sontag because of her relationship to thought. And that's why I read a short story.
Sure.
I
think an even better example of what would appear at first glance to be an absolute 360 on Sontag's part would be what she said about Leni Riefenstahl's Triumph of the Will, on style, where she says, all the people who don't appreciate the sensuousness of this work, the formal elements of the work, who only see it as a Nazi propaganda film, are missing the forest for the trees. And then, in the 70s, she wrote this incredible attack on Leni Riefenstahl, that only focused on her as a perpetuator of fascist agitprop. So, it seems to me both of those things are true. And, and a good mind, and Sontag, had one of the best, is able to hold both of those ideas, in check simultaneously and see that they don't necessarily cancel one another.
Or she wasn't able to bring them together. I mean, one can hold that against her. She could not bring them together. right? They were strong. Each thing was strong, but she developed in such a way that this was strong then, and then that was strong
I mean,
then.
I think to some extent she was reacting against that perception of herself as an aesthete, as a sort of latter-day Bloomsbury who was insufficiently grounded in ethical culture, and so the later work, did take more overtly moralistic stands, and of course you see that in her politics as well.
The reason I reacted to your statement like this is because going back to a subject we raised at the beginning, that criticism used to be more savage. I think that's how it started. And that's perfectly true. And then, so far as I can see, and this is not a complete explanation, the idea of the work of art as organic developed. That is, your judgmental, it used to be much more judgmental. That is, there were good things and bad things in the same work of art. And you could, and it was a kind of, we then thought it was mechanistic to saying this is good and this is bad. Somehow that sinned against our sense of unity based on the organic form of art. And this it's really a question of on my part. I begin against my will almost to prefer the earlier type of criticism, because it allows me to say, well, the artist, or it can sometimes be the critic, makes a mistake, and this is not good. I really don't like this, but I like this. But now, if I have to think that everything goes together into one bundle, that is, if you call this the organic form, then I have to continue to try to bring everything together.
Right. It's a great argument. There's a wonderful, interesting moment in the criticism of Shakespeare, probably in about the mid-19th century, when all of the quote-unquote faults get turned into problems. When people no longer talk about weaknesses in the plays, but no, these are not. We don't quite understand what he was up to. We assume that this must be a single organic entity operating at a single level of exemplary accomplishment, and it's not necessarily the case. I think you're absolutely right.
You're sort of talking about the auteur theory,
Pardon me?
You're sort of talking about the auteur theory in
yes,
film.
in terms of
But I have one, on the journalistic side, I think a lot of the savagery has gone from criticism, because there's this tremendous concept of sell. Everything has to sell, and if it's knocked, if it's torn apart, it's not going to sell very. And there's tremendous pressure, at least in journalism, I know, on the part of publishers and editors to say, well, can't you find something good to say about this? I mean,
Yeah, you see poor Ben Brantley, like the theater critics, twisting themselves into a pretzel when they're going to pan something to find something positive to say that the press agents can use, early on in the review, and it's a terrible burden.
Yeah.
If you want to be scurrilous, you really have to be scurrilous. I mean, totally scurrilous.
Yes, you do.
I read Ivor Winters again recently, essay, I think in the 30s, not sure, on Emily Dickinson. And he called some of her poems abominable. And
that's nice.
I was shocked. Abominable, Emily Dickinson.
That's funny.
I just had a number of thoughts, and one of them is that when you were talking about art criticism here, it's very different whether it's art, painting, sculpture, or writing. And the means of doing it is very different. On top of that, we're addressing more and more, or rather, shall I say, confusing almost, consumerism and criticism. That is, art particularly, we call them plastic arts, are now have become consumer-oriented, and the question then is the artist playing up to the public, or isn't he? Maybe the artist himself or herself doesn't even
Grace was
know
saying,
it.
no? You were going.
So, I mean, that's another question, or kind of a difference. I have other thoughts, but
Okay, does anyone want to respond to that? Okay, I think we have time for one. Jeffrey, were you going to?
No.
Okay,
I've
one last
spoken too
question.
much.
Here.
This is sort of a response to that, and also to what this woman said over here, which is just a layer of something that I don't think is maybe thought about enough when we have this kind of conversation in this moment in time, and that is that some of the arts have become industries. And so money is a big issue that I would wish maybe had been a little more of a factor in this discussion. Although, you know, we have sort of two schools on the panel. We have more the academic, pure intellectual part of criticism, and we have more the commercial, you know, popular part of criticism, and they are quite different. But I think especially when you move towards popular criticism, the influence of money in film, of course, is huge. And really, it seems like there's hardly any arts that are really communities anymore instead of industries. Maybe dance still is. I don't know that much about it, but poetry is one that I think about a lot. Is got the luxury of still essentially being an autonomous art that's independent of industry because there's no money at all anywhere connected to it. So I don't know. I just wondered if there's any thoughts responding.
It's an industry insofar. I hope I'm not being too sharp on this, in that poets do tend to give prizes to other poets of the same coterie. You know, but that's human, I guess. Absolutely, yeah.
But I think books have become writing has definitely become an. Yeah, well, no, more than a little. I mean, I have a friend who wrote a novel a while ago, and a publisher said, "Well, it's good, but it hasn't got enough sex in it." You know,
exactly.
And that's the kind of thing that happens. And so she went back and she dutifully wrote a few sex passages.
It's interesting in movies where money is the biggest issue. I mean, I asked William if he agrees with that. I mean, I don't think criticism is a determining factor, because there's survey after survey that shows when it comes to the big blockbusters that most of the people who are going to go for those first couple critical weekends have decided whether or not to go long before they've read any reviews. That reviews are an almost secondary factor when it comes to...
It depends on the film. Certainly the independent films are very... criticism is very important to a lot of the little independent films. The big blockbusters, you're right, and some of them nobody goes to.
And film criticism is being supported by advertising, which comes from the industry that produces the product, is a major factor in, for example, something that was mentioned, which is the descriptive quality of much criticism. You know, I mean, there is a hugely commercial interrelationship between the critic and the industry in many of these.
Whether the critic realizes it or not sometimes.
Well, the critics who try to be faithful to their themselves and their conscience and their intellect try to write almost in a vacuum. I mean, on the one hand, they're writing for the public, but you're trying to express yourself and not think of yourself as part of the industry. The industry often thinks of critics as part of the industry. It's amazing. They think that you should be there. The job of a critic would be to write objective pieces, if there is such a thing, and their sense of objectivity would be to write something favorable to what they're producing. But they spend so much money, and some of these things fail. Sam Goldwyn, who is known for all of his malapropisms, once said, if the public doesn't want to go, you can't stop them.
Which to finish, before you all go running out, first let me thank our panelists very, very much. It was an extraordinary.
Thank you.